Hello, my name's Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'd like to go through this incredibly famous and renowned and respected novel, exploring its structure in terms of its plot, as well as some of the themes that crop up throughout. Now, this novel was written right at the end of Dostoevsky's life, in 1880. He died in 1881. And in many ways, it encapsulates many of the themes and preoccupations which obsessed Dostoevsky over the course of his adult life. And the book deals with many of the tragedies Dostoevsky himself experienced, including the recent death of his son, Alyosha. He died in 1878, a young boy, just a toddler really, as well as perhaps references to the death of his own father. And of course, the book is filled with this philosophical and theological depth. This book really wrestles with many of the central preoccupations of human existence, including the issues of God, of suffering, and of generally what is the purpose in one's life. Now, The Brothers Karamazov is structured in a very clear way in 4 parts with an epilogue, and each of the parts in turn are subdivided into books, and these books are subdivided into chapters. So actually, despite its length, it's a fairly easy book to navigate because of the way it's laid out by Dostoevsky. And in part 1, we're introduced to the family at the heart of this novel. We have the father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, who's this landowner. Comes from humble beginnings, but he's built up this enormous wealth. But he is a selfish, greedy, self-obsessed, crass, and somewhat heartless individual. All that he really cares about is himself. He's been married a few times. He's got 3 legitimate children, 3 boys. He probably also has another son and probably other children elsewhere. He's quite a nasty piece of work, you could say. And then we're introduced to his 3 sons, who he has not troubled himself to know really. They've only really come back into his life as adults. He kind of farmed them out when they were kids, showed no interest in them really whatsoever. And therefore this sets up this very difficult relationship between the sons and their father. Their mother, or their mothers rather, are no longer on the scene. The oldest boy is Mitya, and he takes up a great deal of the narrative weight in this book, particularly around about the middle of the novel and towards the end. Mitya is this romantic figure. He is driven by his passions, his lusts. He is not a mean-hearted person, but he doesn't think about the devastation he might leave behind him. He can also be very angry and violent. Mitya is driven by the pleasures of the flesh, and he spends most of the novel lusting after this woman called Grushenka, and his father lusts after her as well. Then we're introduced to Ivan, who is this incredibly clever intellectual figure. He's the middle son. He completely renounces faith. He thinks that he has these philosophical ideas in which, in how humanity might exist and move forward in a godless society. He very much sees morality as something we've inherited from religion and perhaps is no longer needed. He's a rather tortured individual as well, as we find out later in the book. And then we're introduced to Alyosha, who is perhaps the hero of the book, although he's not always centre stage. And that's probably the point of Alyosha, because with Alyosha, his life isn't really about him. For Alyosha, he has a deep faith in God, and it's about serving God and other people. Alyosha has been studying at a monastery, and he hugely respects his teacher, his spiritual guide, Elder Zosima, and he very much is Alyosha's father figure. Now, it's Elder Zosima, this much respected monk, who calls together the brothers Karamazov and their father Fyodor to a meeting because there's been some disagreement about land with this guy called Mayusov. Book 2 of part 1 is entitled An Inappropriate Gathering, and it's here that the father Fyodor disgraces himself in front of Elder Zosima and the other monks and clerical figures of the monastery. Mitya also has this blazing row with his father as well. We're also introduced here to Lisa, who Alyosha was engaged to briefly. Book 3, Voluptuaries, introduces us to Smerdyakov, who is in all likelihood an illegitimate son of Fyodor. And he is this figure who suffers with epilepsy. Remember, Dostoevsky suffered with that himself. And he comes across as rather timid and meek, but he seems to be cleverer than he lets on. And there seems to be this rather crafty and devious streak in his character. He is not respected by Mitya or Ivan at all. And he kind of works as Fyodor's lackey on the estate. And he was brought up by this couple, Grigory and his wife, Martha, who are Fyodor's servants. It's here in this book we also learn about Mitya, how he was initially betrothed to this lady called Katerina Ivanova, but he cruelly borrowed money off of her and just left her for another woman, Grushenka, who is the source of much strife in this novel, particularly between Mitya and his father. Perhaps most notably in this book, and the climax of it, is Mitya violently beating up his father. And this is caused by Grushenka, this kind of femme fatale. Both Mitya and Fyodor, his father, are in love with, or at least in lust with anyway. We're then into part 2 of the novel. And book 4 is titled Crack-Ups. And it's here we learn something of the unkindness of Elder Zosima's fellow monks and priests, how they treat him in the monastery. Elder Zosima is very much a holy fool, and not all of his peers understand that about him. Most of the action focuses on Alyosha, who is beginning to come across as this bridge builder between various people, between his brothers, between their brothers' lovers, between their father as well. Alyosha even encounters some school children whom will be very important near the end of the novel. And one of them bites his finger in a rage, and Alyosha visits this child's father. And this child's father, who is this captain, the second grade captain, I think his rank is, he was beaten up by Mitya. So there's this kind of shame running in this family here. The little boy who bites Alyosha's finger is called Ilyusha, and he comes to the fore later on in the novel. Book 5, Pro and Contra, is very famous because it's in this book we get to one of the real parts of the brothers Karamazov, which is it goes really deep theologically, and And it centres around Ivan and Alyosha, kind of two polar opposites, a man of faith and a man of unbelief, strictly of experience and reason and science. And they come together, and it centres around a discussion on this poem Ivan's written called The Grand Inquisitor, whereby Jesus is questioned by the Grand Inquisitor, I think set in 16th century Spain, a bit like the Spanish Inquisition, that kind of thing, about basically how a God of love can allow suffering. And famously, Ivan goes through some of the most terrible things he'd heard about in Russian society, maltreatment and abuse of children, you name it, the worst things, apparently based on real events Dostoevsky read in newspapers. Around this, we have Alyosha again building bridges between Mitya, his elder brother, who'd beaten up this poor second-grade army captain, and pleading for Mitya to apologise to him. And Ivan is persuaded by Smerdyakov to go to Moscow. Book 6, The Russian Monk, is all about the death of Elder Zosima. Also details of events of his life, and very much focuses on Zosima's theology and approach to the religious life. Part 3, we begin with with book 7, which is about Alyosha. And he has this kind of ecstatic vision in front of Elder Zosima's coffin. It's here also that Grushenka, the love interest of Mitya and Fyodor, runs off to be with another ex-lover. And in book 8 is where things really come to a head. Mitya, driven to despair by Grushenka's leaving, it's here that he becomes really paranoid, and he thinks Grushenka's at his father's house, and kind of egged on by Smerdyakov, his father Fyodor ends up dead. And it's unclear about what exactly happens here, but this is the crux of the novel. Turns out that Mitya had whacked Gregory, his father's servant, over the head with a brass pestle, and he thinks he's killed him. But he seems oblivious to the fact that his father has been murdered. He turns up with 3,000 rubles as well at a pawn shop to claim some pistols, which he wants to kill himself with in his despair over Grushenka, and his despair over thinking he's killed this servant, Gregory. And then he goes and finds Grushenka. He travels, and he finds her in this inn, a long distance away, and she is shocked to see him, but he kind of has this splurge, and he spends all this money on wine, on food, on music, on prostitutes, you name it. And he kind of wins Grushenka over. But then his world comes crashing down when the next morning he is arrested. Book 9, which is Preliminary Investigations, details how Mitya is questioned about his whereabouts, about his activities around his father's house the day before. And he finds out that he hasn't killed Gregory, and he's relieved about that. Gregory is just injured, but he completely denies murdering his father. Eventually, there's the issue about where did he get these 3,000 rubles from. Mitya insists it was from Katerina, his previous lover, but it doesn't look good for him. It seems that all the witnesses, all the evidence is going against Mitya, and eventually he's escorted off to jail to await trial. And then we reach the final part 4, where the trial takes place. But before we get to the trial, we have a change of focus to some boys, centred around this rather precocious and pretentious kid called Kolya. And he really looks up to Alyosha, and Alyosha kind of becomes a father figure to these boys. And it turns out this boy who bit Alyosha on the finger, Ilyusha, is dying. And Kolya has been unpleasant to this boy, and Ilyusha wants to be reunited with this boy, and Alyosha persuades Kolya to go to Ilyusha's house with the other boys. And Kolya puts Ilyusha's mind at rest concerning this dog who he thinks had died. Book 11 is about Ivan, and he suffered a mental collapse brought on by his father's death and what he said to Smerdyakov before his father died. Ivan, who believes Smerdyakov is the murderer, not his brother, he said to Smerdyakov that if there's no God, everything is lawful. And he thinks this has had a terrible influence on the actions of Smerdyakov, killing Fyodor, his father. He's also in love with Katerina, who, remember, was previously in a relationship with his brother Mitya. In fact, Ivan meets Smerdyakov, and Smerdyakov admits to the crime. And that night, Ivan has this terrible vision of the devil in his room. He torments Ivan mercilessly. In the following morning, Ivan is told of Smerdyakov's suicide. Book 12, the final book of this part, is all about the trial. And we have these rather vain and pretentious and ambitious lawyers on the prosecution and the defence, the celebrated lawyers of the day, Fechukovich in the defence and Kirillovich in the prosecution. And it seems that Mitya is defended really well by Fechukovich and seems to be winning over the jury, despite the mountain of evidence against him. But sure enough, and somewhat unexpectedly, the jury delivers their verdict. Mitya is guilty. There's then a brief epilogue to this mighty novel, and Ivan and Katerina and actually Grushenka try to get a plan together whereby they're going to rescue Mitya from prison. It's going to be, I think, a 20-year stretch in Siberia. And then right at the end of the epilogue, at the end of the novel, we have the young boy Ilyusha's funeral. Remember, his father was the guy Mitya beat up, this second grade captain. And Ilyusha is this rather saintly child who's passed away, and all the children and Alyosha are around him as he's buried. And Alyosha is there to give comfort to the children, including this young, precocious student Kolya. And Alyosha insists, despite the sadness, despite the suffering, all will be well in the Christian sense because of the hope of the resurrection. So that's, in a nutshell, what happens in the Brothers Karamazov. And the themes are legion. It says so much about the human condition. But I just want to dwell on two or three. The first one being the meaning of life and the path to happiness. This book very much is about what God you serve. And if you look at the different brothers and their father, Fyodor, it's all about himself. He serves himself through his land, through his own interests, without a concern for anybody else. He lives a purely selfish life, which causes him eventually to die, a parricide. You then look at Mitya. His God, if you like, are his passions, his lusts, his romantic attachments, his drinking, his carousing, his partying. Mitya just lives for the moment. He doesn't really care about the consequences of his actions. He's not a bad person in his heart necessarily, but he just lives for his own passions, what he wants at the time. And much of it, of course, is directed towards Grushenka. You then have Ivan. His god, his idol, I suppose, is his intellect. His papers and writings on philosophy and how society should be structured in a post-religious world. For Ivan, it's the vanity of his own intellect, how he thinks he's got everything sewn up. But of course that leads to pain and anguish, like Mitya and like Fyodor. You have Smerdyakov, the half-brother, who seems to be motivated by a desire, I suppose, get his own back, to get one up on the legitimate brothers. He seems to be driven possibly by malice, and he ends up as a suicide. But then we come to Alyosha. Alyosha is somebody who stores his happiness in his belief in God, his faith. And it's Alyosha who is the only character who can possibly bring a sense of optimism out of all the tragedy, the death and the suffering from the brothers Karamazov. He's the one who can say at the end that ultimately all this is in God's hand, and that there is the resurrection which humanity can follow Christ into beyond the cross. So it seems here that Dostoevsky is making the theological point that we all worship something, but the only thing that can bring lasting peace, lasting joy, despite the sufferings of life, is worshipping God, not ourselves and not our passions. So that's the first thing, kind of where to find happiness in life, where to find fulfillment in life. And related to that is this, the theodicy in the Brothers Karamazov, particularly in the Grand Inquisitor chapter. I'm an ordained Anglican priest, and I remember my lecturers going on about this chapter a great deal. And so when I read it in the context of the book, it's a real eye-opener. All of the suffering in this book can be seen as completely pointless. And if God is behind it, he's truly vindictive. Why would he want that for his creatures, if he exists at all? But then we have Alyosha, who would say that this suffering can provoke a sense of compassion and love and kindness in people. And that even through the bad stuff in existence, God can allow a greater good to come forth. That's perhaps made stark at the end of the novel with the death of Ilyusha and Alyosha's confidence despite the unjust and tragic death of this young boy. And of course, connected to that is the idea of free will. If God has created humanity to be free in his love for us, to choose to follow him or to reject him, then if we choose to reject him, suffering and evil is a corollary of that. So freedom is something connected to this, the freedom of the human will. But the final point I'd like to make is one of fatherhood and father figures. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov is a terrible father. He's barely aware of his son's existence for most of their lives. And if you think of what a father should do, a father should be present. And Fyodor isn't. He's absent for most of their lives. A father should protect his children. Fyodor doesn't protect his children. He leaves them at the mercy of others. They've had traumas themselves. We hear about Mitya's trauma as a child. And then a father should teach his children. And Fyodor is the worst possible role model for a child. So he fails as a father in a spectacular fashion. But it's interesting that in the book there is a true role model for a father. And that is Elder Zosima. Alyosha finds a true father in him. Elder Zosima is present in Alyosha's life. He protects Alyosha. Perhaps not physically, but certainly spiritually, he prays for him. Elder Zosima also teaches him, of course, the ways of the church, the Christian life, of loving others, of the hope of the resurrection. And related to this issue of fatherhood, we have childhood as well. Perhaps a Bible quote which could summarise the brothers Karamazov to a certain degree, particularly the end of it. And remember, apparently Dostoevsky originally envisaged this novel to be about children. You might think of Matthew 19:14. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." It seems with this collection of children at the end of the novel, these boys around Alyosha, it seems that they, although they're not perfect, though they're capable of cruelty, of violence themselves, fallen creatures, through their eyes they seem to have this spiritual capacity to receive the message of the Christian faith as provided by Alyosha. It seems that Dostoevsky is reinforcing this idea that to have simple hearts like a child, despite the suffering and sin of the world, is perhaps the best way to attempt to lead our lives. This sense of reception without cynicism, sarcasm, and hostility to the idea of faith. And it seems the children at the end of the book are truly the ones who are able to look up to Alyosha as a father figure, someone who will teach them, protect them, be present in their lives, and give them hope for the future in the resurrection. So, The Brothers Karamazov, a truly great novel. You don't need me to say that, of course. But it's one just so rich in human experience and suffering, but also a degree of hope beyond the suffering. Thanks for watching. If this is your kind of thing, please click like and subscribe. And let me know what you think of this book. Bye.